I think the first question is, what do you mean by organization? So when you say trust within an organization, the question is, where does that start with, or what trust do you need for the decisions that the organization needs to make?
All right, thank you, Wyatt, for joining us here today. We just appreciate the fact that he's been in the data analytics industry for over 15 years, having started out his career in the energy space, moved on into an education tech, as well as into healthcare tech, as well as now finally being into HR tech and managing all the data analytics. So again, thank you, Wyatt. We appreciate you being here.
Yeah, I'm psyched to be here, and excited for what we're about to talk about.
Yeah. So as we've had in previous conversations, we addressed, I feel like, one of the biggest elephants in the room in the analytics space, and that's how to build and develop trust within your organization to actually work on the things that are going to add the most value to the organization. So you mind just kind of talking a little bit about how you develop and build that trust?
Yeah, so I always think the data analytics and business intelligence sits at a really interesting place in an organization where ultimately you have a lot of soft influence, but you don't have any actual influence. Like, you technically have a budget, but you're really just a cost center helping
Right.
other people manage their budgets, right? So how do you
Yeah.
sort of influence across the organization and build that trust to get into that place where you can actually drive the business forward? It's a really
Right.
difficult and interesting problem.
While still being involved in every single department, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's I was drawn to it initially because it's sort of the one place where you can get a real overview of like everything going on in the business. And all of the critical kind of decision making points, it especially today, right? It all flows through analytics in some way,
Right.
shape, or form. Or everyone wants to do an analysis on it. So there's a whole bunch of, you know, debates in the industry that are in the data world that then influence how you even have things like how you're going to structure your data team, like how centralized versus decentralized do you get,
Right.
because people are doing analytics in all these departments anyway. So how do you even communicate the value of a centralized resource, and
Yeah.
why is that important to an organization?
Yeah, like the whole data mesh argument and the whole like citizen developer versus centralizing a business intelligence team. From a more centralized model, which is, I'm assuming, kind of your stance on how things should be done, and correct me if I'm wrong, how do you cultivate that trust and develop within that organization, understanding BI is viewed as a cost center?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with my universal stance is it depends on context and situation, and that's
Good. I
just
love it.
it's the
Yeah.
reality of the world, I think. Um, Generally, I'm actually more a fan of a slightly decentralized model, just
Okay.
having analysts in business units. It gives them a lot more context for like the day to day happening and what that business unit might be
So
worried
like
about.
SMEs or actual analysts that are interacting and interfacing with the data?
I'll start with, again, it depends.
Right.
Um,
Well done.
so, in some cases it's going to be a SME, and in some cases it's going to be a general analyst for that business unit, right? So
Okay.
a case where a SME might be appropriate would be like, I'll say like a marketing attribution analyst, right? Is someone who's going to
Okay.
be very specifically dedicated towards optimizing how marketing is working, right? And where it might be less appropriate is like in a finance department where they're going to have an internal analyst who's going to be doing a bunch of different financial analyses, right? So that's not necessarily a SME, that's more of a generalist in the
Right.
finance department as opposed to marketing. It's going to be someone working on a very narrow, specific problem. And the it depends is like, okay, in that context of there's a narrow problem that requires a specialized skill set here, and there's not one over there. So how do we think about those, and what are the trade-offs?
Right. So in that, from that perspective, then how do you have some form of like indirect reporting to that centralized team?
Yeah,
Uh,
so
I know. Again, it depends.
what I really like is shared learning and feedback in, this is such a overused term, but like in a dedicated safe space. So a challenge I had early in my career was like I was a analyst and then a SME sitting in a marketing department. And I'd sort of look at all the other work that people were doing, thinking like, hey, it's cool. And this was back when I think Hadoop was popular and like a popular
Right.
data engineering
Yeah.
technology. And I had
10,
no
10
idea what
years ago.
Hadoop was or
Yeah.
like how to use Git and what like or how to start to get involved in that sort of thing. Just because I hadn't been exposed to it and my exposure was like purely in Excel, and then I started learning SQL, and that went took my career in one direction. But if I'd started in a department using Hadoop, like maybe I wouldn't have a job today. Who knows? People still use Hadoop, I know, but it's a lot less popular than it once was.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, doing all the map reduce, and a lot of that
yeah,
stuff's been kind of managed away with like the Databricks and Snowflake's decentralized storage that's modeled after that original kind of. Anyways, yeah, keep
yeah.
going. Sorry.
So what I like is those kind of shared learning
Yeah.
environments, where I think there's two things I'll call out. One is like I think you see this in data science communities a lot, where there's like a paper reading group where they might get together once a month and kind of say, here are the interesting bits in this paper that I read, right? And it's some academic thing people are finding on like I don't ArcSid or something along those lines.
Right.
And I've also really like shared feedback sessions, which is just like a code review or someone puts up, here's an analysis that I did for my department. Tell me what's wrong with it, or here's something I'm working on. I'd love to get some feedback on that. Right.
And this is interdepartmental, like
Yeah.
having those analysts kind of come together in a interesting. I love it.
Yeah, and kicking that off can be difficult, but it means kind of coming to that group of analysts and saying, "Hey, here's I have to share a vulnerable moment. Here is something that like you can take, you can run with, you can give me feedback on because I'm taking this and running with it anyway." But kind of being open and vulnerable and saying, "Hey, this is cool and interesting, or this is what I think. Also, I want to know what's wrong with it because I got to go present it up my chain, right?"
Right.
And then the next week or the next month or whatever cadence you decide is appropriate, like you kick it to someone else and you say, okay, like what are you working on that you want some feedback on? And I found that really helps build build a level of trust across the organization in that dedicated analytics group.
So here's a question: how large a size of team? And we've gotten way off track, but we're gonna come
Yeah.
back. Uh, how large of a group do you normally set these to? Because I could see that being extremely difficult to corral and to kind of not allow it to become a 4 hour whole day discussion, right? So, like, what is your kind of population size of group that you found to kind of be that perfect fit?
Yeah, without saying it depends again, I'll say general rule is I do like the agile team or the Amazon two pizza rule.
Okay.
Sort of you need enough people in there that there's a regular topic to kind of come up and talk about on a regular cadence, right? And if there's two people, you're just not going to need feedback on everything like once a
Right.
week, right? So the
Right.
group
But
has to be big enough where that's supported. But if it gets too big,
if it
then you're
gets more
right,
than
it's
7 or
unwieldy.
8, then all of a sudden it becomes kind of like,
Yeah, it's
um,
too many.
yeah, rabbit trailed off, and yeah, I could see that. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's bring it back. So establishing trust within the organization. Help me break that down. How is that occurring? Is that happening within and because you have that decentralized model, or help me talk to me?
Yeah. So I think the first question is, what do you mean by organization? Right. So when you say trust within an organization, the question is where does that start with, or what trust do you need for the decisions that the organization needs to make? So the question underneath that question, I think, is actually does the person in charge of the budget trust me or the analysts that I'm talking to like trust them enough to actually make budget allocations with that decisions? Or if I say, this is not working, you need to pivot, then they go and pivot, right?
Right.
So that's how
So I'm
you
talking
establish
more in
that
terms of
relationship.
like, and I think this is the problem that I've seen with most organizations as we coin it is a more dedicated data team having the ability to say, hey, we're going to focus on resolving these business processes that resolve and clean up our data because the process is broken, which results in the bad data, and then everybody's hurting. But or maybe, hey, we're going to focus on building out these KPIs, this data mart, or identifying those initiatives that's going to bring the largest value to the organization. So getting that kind of air cover to say, hey, we're going to let you work on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's a good question. I think the issue I take in kind of how you've presented it, right, is a super common mistake that I think a lot of data teams make, where they
Great.
come
Let's
in
hear
and
it.
say, "Hey, the process is broken." Right. And I think if you start off by going into a conversation and saying that thing you've been doing for the last, 5 years, 3 years, whatever it is, it doesn't work. We have a better way of doing it. Like, that's not building trust in that
No,
relationship.
no.
Right.
Right.
Um, but it's also such the default of a lot of data teams or just people in general to come in and say, hey, I can improve this. If you just do things my way, it's better. Right. But that's not really the point of
Right.
having that data team. Right. Like it is, but you have to influence appropriately to actually say, hey, we're going to make changes to this process, because what actually helps is coming in with a discovery mindset, because sometimes there's reason things are done a certain way, right? And
Of course.
because data has context across all the business, they can bring all of that stuff together, right? So I actually think a really good example is the issues that current privacy regulations put in the way of like actually getting stuff done for a business, right? Where the data team sits there and says, well, you can't have access to like private data,
Right.
but the business also sometimes looks at that private data and says, man, would that be really useful for some decisions we need to make, right?
Right.
So how do you navigate that complexity? um, and
So you're talking about like masking of PII data, and then they're not able to actually leverage and utilize that. Is that what you're? It seems like that's where you're yeah.
yeah,
And
um, and that's not inherently a bad thing, right? But sometimes the business wants access to it anyway, so like how do you manage that conversation? And sometimes it's like, okay, I need to actually get legal in the room to say this is an okay use case for PII, and we're going to approve it to flow through for the next four
right.
weeks or whatever the case is. But helping the business navigate that is very important, or can be, again, depending on your organization.
So why don't we kind of shift gears and move towards ways an analytics team can drive and produce and deliver value to the business.
Yeah. So I think I put these into kind of three large buckets. Right. So one is very simple cost savings projects, right? So you alluded to this when you said, hey, like we have a broken process, right?
Right.
Well, if you go fix a process, you're going to reduce some cost somewhere in that
Right.
that funnel. Um,
And open
is
up opportunities. Right.
Right. Right. It can be opening up opportunities. It can also be a very simple, like, we saved money in the budget. Purely from a data hat perspective, this is like why I think data engineering teams get into trouble with, like, we've reduced Snowflake spend this quarter, right? It's a super
Yeah.
common goal, and I think it misses the point, because let's say, not that you want your Snowflake costs to get out of control, but it kind of misses the point, because the point is that you're helping the business reduce their costs, not just the
Yeah.
engineering team.
Yeah.
And getting out there and doing that is more important probably than whatever the engineering team
But
spends.
you're hitting on like a much bigger problem where data teams become an entity unto themselves, right? And I'm sorry to take us off the track, but and keep going, but that seems to be a fundamental problem, right? Is this notion that the data team itself, because of all the value they're adding, is an entity unto itself. So it looks into how do we optimize and create things efficiently within our own lives, so we can better serve the community at large.
Yeah, and I think if you end up in that situation, I would argue that your data team might be too centralized, right? Because that plays into this as well. So if it means you have too much of a control structure probably underneath the data team, and you're not supporting the other business units enough when that data team isn't, like I said, an entity of in and of itself. So, super interesting philosophical discussion on that. Anyway, I had two more bullets there, but I think the other two is what I'll call incremental improvement. Um, and this is, to me, is sort of the standard, like, data science A/B testing, like we're going to make this button red versus blue, and the blue one is better, so therefore there's an incremental increase, right? Like that is a SME, it's a dedicated skill set that says, we're improving the website in this particular way. Now, the interesting split there for me is when you're in a B2B versus a B2C business, if
Right.
you're buying something on Amazon, right, it's a lot easier to kind of say, hey, the color of this button directly impacts this purchase. Whereas in a B2B world, it's a much longer sales cycle. There's a lot more
Right.
touch points and there's attribution modeling involved, but it's a whole different set of thinking. It's a whole fascinating segue we could go down,
Right.
but I don't know if we want to just here. The last thing, and I think a common mistake I've seen is in the B2B world, you'll run an A/B test and then say, hey, we've increased revenue by some amount, but you've killed some other metric down the funnel. That means that doesn't actually play through, right? So this is like if you increase engagement on the website, that might matter and it might not, depending on how many of those convert to a purchase, right? So just thinking through, okay, what is the metric and what is the counter metric to this, and how are we kind of balancing those things to make sure that
Hmm.
the whole process is improving. So and again, data being at the center and kind of having that holistic view of the business is critical to that success.
So it seems like you're saying that, and bear with me. I'm trying. I want to make sure I'm fully understanding this. This whole notion of a counter metric is kind of novel to me. So I want to see if I'm hitting it, and you tell me if I get this right. So a counter metric would actually be nominalized by the advent of a new metric.
So say you have a two-step process, right? So if you're running a website and
Okay.
you care about the number of views on your website and how many people add something to a cart and then how many people check out, right?
Okay.
You might optimize for view increases on the website, thinking that'll have
Got
a
it.
downstream impact on cart checkout. So your counter metric, right, might be the ratio of add to cart versus website views.
Got it. So bear with me. Let me see if I can create a similar scenario and throw it back to you, and you tell me if I got it. In a marketing situation, right? Let's suppose you were looking at cold email, right? Or even warm email, right? And you're looking at open and reply rate, right? And so you're using that as a KPI for determining its performance, right? And then you also concurrently have customer journey where you have all events related and associated with that customer. Well, if you just isolate it to just looking at the paradigm, like you said, two dimensionally, what is the open rate and what's the reply rate, but you neglect to see the impact of calls or messages on a third party platform, or like going out some of that person meeting together for a lunch or whatever it may be. And you have that customer journey that has that data, to neglect the event attribution to that open rate or that reply rate would actually create that counter metric. So in the sense that reply rate actually increased because you had that other event with that customer, whether this is where I guess B2B, right? Versus that instance where if you didn't have that, then you would be looking at it and saying, hey, my content nailed it and we actually saw a higher reply rate, as opposed to the fact that you just closed out a booth at an event and you had an overlap in your campaign of some of those people, and so they replied.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's more a confusion of segmentation than like a counter metric, right? So
Okay.
I think here's another example. This is a real life thing that happened to me. So I was a analyst for a sales department, and we were tracking the amount of clients we met with and the amount of wins that we booked. Right
Okay.
now, definition wise is important. So these were all in period metrics. So within a quarter, we met with 100 clients and we closed 30 deals. We
Okay.
had an approximate lag time or a time to close from meeting of like 90 days. So we would typically meet with clients and then close things in the next quarter,
Right.
obviously depending on when things came in throughout the quarter, and fun timing dynamics there. But what had happened was the business made a bunch of changes, and I forget exactly what they were because this is a while ago at this point. But the gist was the win rate spiked for a quarter. Now, what are the possible causes of that? Either we won a lot more deals than we thought we would or than we had historically, or we met with a lot fewer clients, right? And the issue was we actually had a decrease in the clients we were meeting with, right? So that's actually going to be a problem for next quarter, but this quarter it means that win rate metric looks pretty good.
Got it. So because you dealt with, or you interfaced with less clients, you were able to give them more attention and appropriate attention and evaluating their proper needs. And so you had a higher win rate. Am I understanding that properly?
Yeah, but the business did worse because we didn't make up for the decrease in wins in the next quarter by an increase in quality of meeting. So like that's
Got,
the metric is the
the
number of meetings, and the
Yeah,
counter
so win
metric
rate
the
is
win rate.
good, and then the counter metric was the fact that you had the lower meetings, so you're going to have a lower win rate the following quarter.
Yeah, that's correct, and that causes
Got it.
issues, right?
Okay, got it. Awesome. So so if I'm bringing this full circle, right? We kind of addressed like what is the value that, or what's some of the value that the data analytics team can drive to the business and the organization. And if I understood you, it's kind of like the incremental value adds, right? So you're improving that which already exists and being able to demonstratively prove that, right?
Yeah.
And then if I'm understanding the identification of counter metrics relative to current KPIs, is that a kind of good way to nutshell it, or?
Yeah, well, I think there's an addendum there too, where so going through the outcomes from that, right? I had to go navigate the discussion with that leader to say, actually, it's bad that your win rates are up, right? So let's think about the outcomes here and what's going to happen in a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, right? So now the thing at this particular company, those wins translated like into onboarding planning for those clients because there's a number of like consultants that were engaged ahead of time based on the number of deals.
Right.
So there's also a supply chain downstream impact
Yeah,
where the guy
you have to manage
says,
your pipeline respective to that win rate.
right. So there's a much broader impact of analytics, which is saying, hey, the business didn't have to go spend as much money onboarding clients, right? Or on those onboarding consultants in this case. And say, hey, we'll have more work for you next quarter once we fix some things up funnel. But like managing that cost is A, really impactful to the business, B, almost impossible to like measure or prove that the analytics team had a damn thing to do with, because it's the
Right.
analytics person going and saying, hey, I've had this impact and it's happening downstream and it's an important thing. But the person getting credit for that is the person who makes the decision in onboarding that says, I see fewer wins because I saw this particular analysis, I'm going to make these business decisions. And that's why analytics become such a cost function where it's like everybody feels like they need it, but they can't always articulate why or what those decisions or what or how those decisions are important to their everyday process. I think the net is usually that it's good for the business of kind of having this consolidated in one place. But you kind of have to accept that there's going to be a lot of things that happen where you just have to be able to say, I kicked that off or I had a hand in it, but it was someone else's call.
Right. So how do you strategically communicate that value then?
I say, so it's best when they do it for you.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So I think the typical answer is often just document the impact on all these things. And that's not a bad answer, right? It's like keep a log of how you influence decisions across the organization. Like, yes, absolutely. It's much better, or what I found is great, is if you, in that conversation, right? So you might go and present an analysis to, I forget the title, but the guy who's in charge of onboarding. So presenting this analysis to this person. And in that meeting, they will draw the conclusion that you want them to draw, right? Which is, I want you to make this decision. And when they do that, you have to be like, that's a great idea. I'm so happy you thought of that, right? Like, that's incredible.
Right.
Even though you're sitting there being like, yes, that was the obvious thing because you've been sitting in the data and trying to get them to make this decision for probably a month, 2 months, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So when they go make that decision, you just have to be really happy that like they agreed with you and that it was their idea. And the more that it's their idea, the more they'll be like, you know, the analytics team did great work on this thing. I need more of their support in other decisions.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things I think I've done that I feel like is what you're talking about is also documenting the value add that that individual contributed to the organization, and then sending out an email with the information saying how much value that they added. So like, oh, I just want to point out we did some analytics on the value that Jeff produced. And so Jeff did this amazing job and we actually were able to see this and these metrics because of these business changes that he made, right? And then you
Yeah.
push that out to the organization and then you end up getting this like praise to him. And then there's also like at the same time, he understands kind of the hand that fed him, and so
Yeah.
he's going to make sure that it's reciprocated and saying, like, he's not going to necessarily say, oh, no, I didn't make that decision, but he's going to say, hey, I was able to do that because of this. Right.
Yeah. I think that's exactly it. Now, it's like bringing this full circle again. That's also where countermetrics become super, super important. So, right, an example, this is something I lived. I had done some analysis where we'd basically gone in and said, hey, here's some A/B testing and a thing when we think if we make these changes, we'll increase revenue of this company by something like 30%. And like, that's a huge number. It was a small company, but it was a huge number. We kind of neglected the quality drop off. We were like, yes, if everything stays exactly the same, this A/B test will result in a 30% increase in revenue. Now, my boss at the time, I think, went and broadcast that to the company, and the actual increase was something like 10%, right? So, like, still large, but nowhere near the promised 30.
Yeah.
And when that's used in other decisions, it's like you have to be aware that whatever you were testing may not play out in the exact same way in the future. And that's not a reason to not do it, but it is a reason to think about that and like think about the countermetrics and how you're presenting that out to the organization, because it's always walking that line between under promising and over delivering and over
Of course.
promising
Yeah.
and under delivering, right? And
Yeah. And you say the 30 number and you have a 10% increase, right? And it's 2x what the highest all time high increase ever was. And there's disappointment.
right. Right.
Yeah.
And like that's not a great situation to be in to go and navigate. So then
Right.
like just don't put yourself in that situation to begin with.
Right. Hence the criticality of those countermetrics to kind of offset that value proposition. So,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And having that understanding, might have made that particular email a little bit more tempered. Obviously, I have some particular scars from this situation. So then this,
oh, of course,
countermetrics was
I
like
could only imagine
my
like you help and you provide the levers needing to be pulled and say, hey, as long as these variables remain the same, this is our forecasted value change. It blows out anything historically, and it's frowned upon because the anticipation was much higher.
yeah, yeah. It's not
And
the worst
so,
scar I have, but it was an important lesson for sure.
well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking this time to just kind of evaluate how to develop trust within the organization, how to kind of define value and then showcase that value. So we look forward to having you again, and just really appreciate your time, Wyatt.
Yeah, thanks for having me and letting me ramble for a little bit about something I care a lot about. So
No,
much
this
appreciated.
has been a pleasure. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.